In the shadowed heart of Louisiana's bayous, where secrets fester like forgotten graves, 17 souls vanished into the night, traded not for gold but for sins unspoken. Between March and November of 1849, 17 male slaves vanished from the household ledgers of Blackwater's most esteemed lineages. Official accounts claim they were bartered to far-off plantations. Yet the steamer manifests bear no whisper of such dealings. What the parish scrolls hid was something far more forsaken than mere ledger sins. In the shadowed galleries of Magnolia Hill's grandest estates, behind bolted doors draped in faded Creole lace, 8 women from Louisiana's ancient bloodlines had woven a pact so unholy that its unveiling would summon the Louisiana Assembly into frantic midnight vigil. The men were never traded. They never fled Blackwater, and what these women wrought upon them would linger as Louisiana's most veiled blasphemy for over 7 decades. Before we delve deeper into the chronicle of Blackwater's concealed covenant, pause a spell to subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy and toll that notification bell. We unearth the gloomiest hollows of American lore that others shun like cursed ground. And in the comments below, whisper what parish or bayou town you hearken from. Now, let us sink into the scented gloom of Magnolia Hill. The spring of 1849 caught Blackwater at the pinnacle of its antebellum splendor. The town's souls had burgeoned to nearly 28,000. Its sugar warehouses flanked the Mississippi like shrines to King Cotton's sweeter, more languid kin. Magnolia Hill loomed over the trading quarters, a realm of pillared manors where Louisiana's eldest clans kept their river residences. These were not the fresh fortunes of the cane trade, but heirs of colonial nobility, whose roots in Louisiana earth predated the purchase. The women who convened in these halls on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons cloaked themselves as exemplars of Southern grace. They marshaled alms for the destitute, arranged blooms for St. Mary's Episcopal Church, and upheld the ornate social sacraments that divided Louisiana gentry from plain riches. Their husbands held seats in the state assembly, oversaw cane ventures, and pleaded cases. Their daughters mastered French and harpsichord. Their sons studied at the College of Tulane and Loyola. Eliza Voss reigned over this veiled domain with the hushed command of ancient wealth. At 43, she had claimed the Voss sugar legacy upon her father's passing, and stewarded it with a shrewdness that startled Blackwater's male mercantile circle. Her husband, Abram Voss, sat as a circuit court judge and wandered much through Louisiana's bayou parishes. The Voss Manor on Cypress Street flaunted 12 chambers, a melody parlor, and lodgings for 23 enslaved souls. Among Eliza's innermost kin was Calpurnia Delacroix, a far-flung cousin of the president's lineage, whose husband held sway over 3 sugar depots. Then there was Ruth Claiborne, sprung from one of Natchitoches' founding stocks, who tended 2 holdings in Magnolia Hill and a 1,000-acre estate in Point Coupe Parish. Eveline Marrow had wed into banking opulence, but bore a lineage that outspanned the Union by 2 centuries. Her family vines entwined with every notable Louisiana house since 1650. These women comprehended dominion in manners their husbands could not wholly fathom. While men brandished sway through edict and trade, Southern women of their station wielded mastery through subtler veins. They governed estates harboring dozens of enslaved souls, mediated quarrels, meted out chastisement, and issued daily decrees touching multitudes of fates. Within their hearth realm, they were sovereign queens. Yet by early 1849, something had stirred in the fragile equilibrium of Magnolia Hill society. Those who watched keenly might have discerned that Eliza Voss's Tuesday afternoon gatherings had turned more secluded. The roster had shrunken from 20 women to 8. The attendants who served these assemblies were ever the same and ever male. The gallery doors stayed barred during these convocations, peculiar in an age when virtuous dames kept portals ajar to safeguard honor. Blackwater's black kinfolk discerned more. House bondsmen murmured of odd summonses, of men called to manors where they bore no habitual labors. Kin in Gator's Hollow spoke of spouses and offspring who faded into Magnolia Hill abodes and returned, altered, silent, their gazes locked on some dim horizon as though dreading a straight stare. Silas, a 31-year-old man bound to the Voss clan, had attended as Eliza's personal aide since her father's demise. He towered 6 feet tall with the carriage of one granted kinder handling than most enslaved, having been schooled to read despite Louisiana law forbidding such enlightenment. He had been nurtured in the Voss household, his mother serving as Eliza's childhood minder. This closeness had forged a bond more tangled than mere possession, an interplay that Eliza had begun to probe in ways that transgressed every limit of her realm. On a Tuesday afternoon in early March, Eliza beckoned Silas to her secluded drawing room, a sanctum her husband seldom breached. What unfolded in that chamber over the ensuing hours would etch a ritual that would creep through Magnolia Hill's noble homes like malaria through a sweltering shanty. The afternoon of March the 6th, 1849 began with uncommon climb for early spring. A sultry breeze had drifted up from the Gulf, lifting temperatures into the low 70s and shrouding Blackwater in humid haze more akin to June. In the Vos Menor, Eliza had banished all servants save Silas, dispatching them on chores that would bind them for hours. The window drapes were pulled despite the mild air, and she had sealed the door to her drawing room from within. What transpired in that chamber was never inscribed in Eliza's precise diaries, which chronicled every social visit and domestic outlay. But Silas would later confide to his wife Magnolia, who toiled in the Delacroix household, that Mrs. Voss had summoned him under the guise of shifting furnishings. Instead, she had bidden him to sit, a command that shattered every etiquette of their kinship. She had poured him tea, another absurdity in the stern hierarchy of a slave state. Then she had begun to speak of solitude, of her husband's endless wanderings, of the strange seclusion of a woman wed to obligation rather than fellowship. Her words had commenced as admission but morphed into something more perilous. She had grazed his hand. She had posed queries about his missings, his yearnings, regarding him for those eerie hours as something beyond chattel. And then she had voiced a plea that crumbled the bedrock structure of their world. Silas departed that room 3 hours later with orders to tell no one, with the sure wisdom that defiance was futile, and with the awareness that Tuesday afternoons would now adhere to this new unnatural cadence. Eliza emerged with a bloom to her cheeks and a spark in her eyes that her returning servants ascribed to the untimely warmth. Within a week, Eliza had entrusted Calpurnia Delacroix during a dawn call. The two women had been companions since girlhood, their clans allied through eras of unions and dealings. Whatever Eliza disclosed in that exchange, Calpurnia replied not with revulsion, but with intrigue. She posed questions, she weighed reckonings. She pondered aloud whether her own estate might harbor similar pacts. 2 weeks after Eliza's initial sin, Calpurnia summoned Magnolia's husband, Ezra, to her private quarters under the pretense of mending a slack window hasp. The window needed no mending. By April, 6 more women from Magnolia Hill's innermost fold had embraced the custom. The women began convening routinely, ostensibly for their benevolence with the Blackwater Female Orphan Refuge, but their dialogues had assumed an altered essence. They spoke in veiled tongue about their pacts, weighing methods, debating arrangements. Ruth Claiborne unveiled she had begun cycling between 3 different men from her household retinue. Eveline Merrow confessed she favored men in their late 20s, finding them more vital than older slaves, yet more restrained than younger ones. What had originated as Eliza's secluded trespass evolved into something more structured, more methodical. The women forged doctrines. They exchanged their enslaved men amid households, crafting a revolving timetable that dispersed the peril of revelation. If a servant was too oft called to one mistress's secluded chambers, doubts might stir. But if he was dispatched on errands betwixt households, if his absences could be blamed on rightful duties, the pattern grew harder to trace. By May of 1849, the 8 women had founded what they dubbed, with willful mockery, the Sisterhood of Mercy. The title served at-win role. It mirrored their formal veil of merciful deeds while scorning the very notion of Christian piety they professed to incarnate. They convened every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, alternating amid their diverse abodes. The assemblies commenced with genuine merciful affairs, missives penned to the orphan refuge or schemes laid for church gatherings, forging records of rightful pursuit. But once this mask was set, the true intent of their convocations unfolded. The women had crafted a scheme of such intricate secrecy that it would have awed Blackwater's malicious strategists. Each woman maintained 2 sets of household scrolls, one for her husband's scrutiny displaying ordinary costs and doings, another concealed scroll tracing the true calendar of their pacts. They enlisted trusted female house slaves as sentinels, stationing them at key vantage to vigil for unforeseen returns of husbands or unbidden callers. They devised hand gestures and veiled sayings. "We will need additional linen," meant a meeting was affirmed. "The roses require attention," signaled a annulment duetto hazard. The men they beckoned had no voice in their involvement. Silas, Ezra, and the others dwelt in a realm of deep soul torment. They were being wielded in ways that ravaged them as wholly as any brutality. Yet they could not defy without courting chastisement or auction. Some had wives, children, kin who would endure if they rebuffed or unveiled what was transpiring. They were ensnared in a nightmare of their mistress's forging, compelled to partake in their own despoilment while upholding utter hush. As spring yielded to summer, the pact began to reveal fissures in its meticulously built veneer. The first omen arose from an unforeseen quarter, the enslaved women of Magnolia Hill. Magnolia had beheld her husband alter over those moons. Ezra had ever been sturdy, proud despite his chains, a man who held his worth through minor defiances and quiet denials. But after Calpurnia Delacroix began beckoning him to her secluded chambers, something within him had fractured. Hesiest meeting Magnolia's gaze, he recoiled when she brushed him. At night, he lay stiff beside her and she could hear his breath snag as though he were gulping cries. She was not solitary in marking these shifts. In the cookhouses and washrooms of Magnolia Hill, enslaved women amassed tidings like scouts in the mist. They traded whispers about which men were being summoned, how oft, under what ruses. They noted that these men were always the youngest, sturdiest, most comely. They noted their mistresses' flushed visages after these private trysts, the peculiar contentment in their countenances. The women grasped what was unfolding long before any white soul in Blackwater surmised, and they confronted an impossible dilemma. Unveil the violation and risk their kin being rent asunder through sale and penalty, or stay mute and witness their husbands, brothers and sons be wielded in ways that debased all entangled. Ada, enslaved by Ruth Claiborne, resolved to move. She was 53 years old, had reared Ruth from cradle, and bore the odd sway sometimes bestowed on enslaved women who had suckled their owners as babes. In early June, she faced Ruth outright, selecting an instant when the two were solitary in the morning room. "Miss Ruth," Ada uttered, her tone firm despite the vast peril she embraced, "I need to speak plain with you about what has been happening in this house." Ruth placed her teacup with measured care. "You forget yourself, Ada." "No, ma'am. I am remembering myself, remembering that I raised you, that I have been loyal to this family for 37 years. And I am telling you that what you and those other ladies are doing, it is going to bring ruin down on all our heads." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Ruth's face had gone pale, then flushed deep red. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with fury and fear. "You will never speak of this again to anyone. Do you understand me?" "I understand that sin finds its way to light no matter how deep you bury it," Ada replied. "I understand that you cannot do this to these men without it corrupting everything it touches." Ruth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Get out, and if you value your daughter's safety, you will never mention this subject again." The threat was explicit. Ada's daughter, just 14 years old, worked in the Claiborne kitchen. Ruth was reminding Ada of how easily that daughter could be sold south, sent to the cane fields where life expectancy rarely exceeded 10 years. Ada left the morning room with her head high. But Ruth's warning accomplished its purpose. Ada would not speak of it again, at least not to anyone white. But she did speak to the other women, and together they began to strategize. If they could not stop the abuse directly, perhaps they could create enough disruption to make it too dangerous to continue. Small acts of sabotage began to plague the 8 households. Linens disappeared, meals were oversalted, messages went undelivered. Nothing so dramatic as to warrant severe punishment, but enough to create friction to make the smooth operation of these households less reliable. The Sisterhood noticed, but misinterpreted these disruptions. They believed their enslaved workers were simply becoming lazy, growing too comfortable in their positions. This interpretation led them to increased discipline, which only deepened the resentment and expanded the careful campaign of resistance. By July, a different threat had emerged from an unexpected direction. Abram Voss, Eliza's husband, had returned early from his circuit court travels due to a case being postponed. He arrived home on a Tuesday afternoon, precisely when Eliza's salon was in session. The front door was locked from inside, highly unusual for a social gathering. He could hear women's voices in the gallery, but also something else, sounds that did not align with charitable committee work. Abram entered through the kitchen entrance, startling the servants, who had been given strict instructions to admit no one during these meetings. Before they could warn their mistress, He had walked through the house and reached the gallery door. It was locked. From inside came a murmur of female conversation, punctuated by something else, a deeper voice, definitely male. "Eliza," he called, knocking firmly. "Open this door." The conversation stopped abruptly. There followed perhaps 30 seconds of silence, then footsteps, the sound of the key turning. Eliza opened the door with her face composed in perfect calm, though Abram noticed a slight disarray to her hair and a brightness to her eyes that suggested agitation. "Abram, you are home early." How unexpected. Her tone was light, but he caught the edge of anxiety beneath it. He looked past her into the gallery. 5 other women were present, all from the highest echelons of Blackwater society, and standing by the window, looking distinctly uncomfortable, was Silas. There was no apparent reason for a male slave to be present during a ladies' charitable meeting. "What is he doing here?" Abram asked, his gaze fixed on Silas. "He was moving a desk for us," Eliza replied smoothly. "The afternoon light had shifted and we needed to rearrange the furniture." Silas was just leaving. It was a plausible explanation, yet something about the scene troubled Abram. The women's faces showed not the relaxed comfort of social visiting, but a tension he could not quite identify. Silas's expression was carefully blank, but his posture suggested shame rather than the neutral demeanor expected from a servant completing a simple task. Abram let it pass with a nod, but over the following days he found himself watching his wife more carefully. He noticed patterns he had previously overlooked: the locked doors, the specific servants present during her salons, her insistence on absolute privacy during these gatherings. He said nothing, but his attention had been awakened, and once awakened, it would prove difficult to deceive. The summer heat had descended on Blackwater with oppressive weight by late July, turning the town into a slow cooking pot of humidity and tension, the air heavy with the scent of wilting magnolias. The 8 women of the Sisterhood grew bolder, even as warning signs multiplied around them. Perhaps it was the intoxication of transgression, the addictive quality of violating every rule that had governed their lives since birth. Perhaps it was simply that they had gone too long without consequences and had begun to believe themselves untouchable. Eliza had added 2 more men to her rotation by August, both from her country property, whom she had transferred to Blackwater under the pretext of needing additional household staff. She had also begun hosting evening gatherings in addition to the afternoon salons, small dinners where the wine flowed freely, and the conversation turned increasingly frank about their arrangements. The women had begun to treat their systematic exploitation as an open secret among themselves, discussing it with the casual matter-of-factness that other ladies might use when talking about new dress patterns or the quality of their gardens. Calpurnia Delacroix had begun documenting their activities in a coded journal using a cipher she had learned from her father. Each man was assigned a number, each woman a letter. Encounters were recorded with dates and brief notes about satisfaction level. She kept this journal in a locked drawer of her writing desk, convinced that the code made its contents impenetrable to anyone who might discover it. What Calpurnia did not know was that Ezra, the man she summoned most frequently, could read. He'd been taught by Calpurnia's father years before, during a period when some slaveholders still believed education might make their human property more valuable. Ezra had seen Calpurnia working in her journal, had noticed where she kept the key. Late one night in August, while Calpurnia and her husband slept, Ezra had carefully picked the desk lock using a wire from a broken corset stay. He could not immediately break the cipher, but he carefully copied several pages onto paper he had stolen from the kitchen accounts ledger. He hid these copies in the cellar, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath a loose stone. He was not certain what he would do with this evidence, but he understood instinctively that documentation was power, even for someone who had no legal standing to possess power. Ezra shared his discovery with Silas, and together they began to conceive of something unprecedented, a way to expose their mistresses that might not result in their own destruction. They needed anally someone white who possessed both the authority to act and the moral courage to do so. They found him in an unexpected place. Reverend Malcolm Thorne had served at St. Mary's Episcopal Church for 11 years. At 62, he was respected but not beloved, known for sermons that emphasized duty and judgment rather than comfort and grace. He was also unusually vocal in his belief that slavery, while perhaps necessary, was not inherently virtuous and carried moral responsibilities that most slaveholders shirked. This position had not made him popular with Magnolia Hill's elite, but his social standing and education protected him from direct criticism. Silas's mother, Eveline, worked in the church as a cleaner. She'd known Reverend Thorne since his arrival in Blackwater and had occasionally spoken with him about matters of faith and morality. In late August, Silas asked his mother to arrange a private meeting with the Reverend, claiming he needed spiritual counsel regarding a matter of conscience. The meeting took place in the church's small library on an evening when no services were scheduled. Silas had never been so frightened in his life. He was about to accuse some of Blackwater's most powerful women of profound moral transgression. If Thorne did not believe him, or worse, if Thorne believed him but chose to protect the women rather than pursue justice, Silas would likely be sold south before the week ended. But Silas had judged his man correctly as he described what was happening, choosing his words carefully to convey the abuse without explicit detail. He watched Thorne's face transform from skepticism to horror to cold fury. When Silas finished speaking, the Reverend sat in silence for several minutes, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "These are serious accusations," Thorne finally said. "I am aware, but there is documentation, sir, written evidence kept by Mrs. Delacroix, and there are witnesses if they could be convinced to speak. Every enslaved person in those 8 households knows what has been happening." Thorne stood and paced to the window, looking out at Magnolia Hills Manors silhouetted against the evening sky. Candle flames flickering like distant souls. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do? To accuse these women would be to shake Blackwater society to its foundations. I would be challenging some of the most powerful families in Louisiana." "I understand, sir. I also understand that what they are doing is evil, and that evil thrives when good men choose comfort over truth." The Reverend turned back to face Silas, and in his eyes was the glint of something fierce and uncompromising. "I will need the written evidence." "Can you obtain it without being caught?" "Yes, sir. I believe I can." "Then do so. Bring it to me here in 3 days. "And Silas," Thorne paused, "I want you to know that I believe you and I will act on this regardless of the personal cost. Some sins are too profound to overlook." The next 3 days passed in exquisite tension. Ezra and Silas waited for an evening when the Delacroix household was hosting a dinner party when Calpurnia would be occupied for hours and unable to check her private chambers. On the evening of September 1st, as guests arrived and servants rushed through their duties, Ezra slipped upstairs. His hands shook as he picked the desk lock again. The journal was exactly where Calpurnia kept it. He removed it carefully, wrapping it in a kitchen towel he had brought for this purpose. He placed a book of similar size and weight in the drawer so that if Calpurnia checked, she would feel the expected resistance and weight when she opened it. Then he descended the servants' stairs and handed the journal to Silas, who was waiting in the garden. Silas ran through the evening streets to St. Mary's Church. Reverend Thorne was waiting in the library, and together they sat under lamplight and began to decode Calpurnia's cipher. It was simpler than Calpurnia had imagined, a basic substitution code that yielded to patient analysis. Within 2 hours, they had translated enough pages to confirm everything Silas had described. The journal entries were explicit and damning. Calpurnia had recorded names, dates, and details with the meticulous care of someone who had no fear of discovery. She had even assigned ratings, numerical scores for each man's performance. Reading these pages, Thorne's face grew increasingly rigid with disgust. "This is enough," he said finally. "More than enough. I will take this to Bishop Claiborne tomorrow. He will have to convene a church inquiry, and from there this will reach the civil authorities." "And what will happen to us?" Silas asked. "To the men who were used this way?" Thorne looked at him with genuine sorrow. "I do not know. I wish I could promise you protection, but the truth is that Louisiana law sees you as property, not victims. The women will face social ruin and possibly criminal charges, but you will face the consequences of your master's choices. It is profoundly unjust, but it is the world we live in. We know the risk, sir, but this has to end, not just for us, but for anyone else who might suffer this way in the future." Thorne nodded slowly. "Return the journal to where you found it. Let them have no warning of what is coming." "Can you do that without being caught?" "I can try, sir." Silas ran back to the house where the dinner party was still in progress. He returned the journal to Ezra, who had been waiting in growing panic. Ezra ascended the stairs again, replaced the journal in the desk, and relocked the drawer. The whole theft had lasted less than 3 hours, and as far as anyone in the household knew, nothing unusual had occurred. But the next morning, Reverend Thorne traveled to the home of Bishop Josiah Claiborne, the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, and one of the most influential religious figures in the state. Thorne brought with him detailed notes from Calpurnia's journal, including specific dates, names, and descriptions that could not be dismissed as slander or confusion. Bishop Claiborne had served as bishop for 18 years. He was 73 years old, stern in manner, and deeply conservative in his social views. He believed slavery was ordained by God as a means of bringing Christian civilization to an inferior race, a view shared by most white Louisianans of his class. But he also believed that with ownership came heavy moral responsibility, and that slaveholders who abused their position would answer to divine judgment. As Thorne laid out the evidence, Bishop Claiborne's expression moved through stages of disbelief, shock, and fury. When Thorne finished, the bishop sat in silence for several minutes, his age suddenly visible in the sag of his shoulders and the heaviness of his breathing. "If this is true," he said finally, "it represents a moral corruption so profound that I can scarcely comprehend it. These are women I have known for decades, women who sit in my church every Sunday and profess Christian virtue. It is true, Your Grace. I have seen the written evidence. I have spoken to witnesses. Then we have no choice but to act. But Malcolm, do you understand what this will unleash? This is not simply a matter of individual sin. This will expose rot at the heart of Blackwater's social order. It will suggest that the very women we trust to uphold moral standards, to raise children and manage households, are capable of profound evil. I understand, but the alternative is to allow this to continue, to become complicit through our silence." Bishop Claiborne stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the morning light on Blackwater streets, convene a private inquiry, select 5 men of unimpeachable character, men with no family ties to the accused women. I will preside over the proceedings myself. We will hear the evidence, interview the witnesses, and determine the truth of this matter. If these accusations prove accurate, we will turn our findings over to the civil authorities. May God have mercy on us all. The inquiry was convened in absolute secrecy on September 10th in a private room at St. Mary's Church. The 5 men Bishop Claiborne selected were all respected community leaders, but none from Magnolia Hill's innermost circle. They included a merchant, a physician, a lawyer, a plantation owner from Plaquemines Parish, and a professor from Loyola College. All had been sworn to confidentiality and understood they were investigating matters of extraordinary sensitivity. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Blackwater intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. The inquiry began with Reverend Thorne presenting his evidence and explaining how it had come to his attention. The panel members listened in growing shock as he described the system the 8 women had established. Then he presented his transcriptions from Calpurnia's journal, reading selected passages aloud. The explicit nature of the entries left no doubt about what had occurred. Next came the witnesses. Silas testified first, describing in careful, restrained language what Eliza Voss had subjected him to. His dignity in the face of such violation moved several panel members to visible emotion. Ezra followed, corroborating Silas's testimony and adding details about Calpurnia Delacroix's behavior. 3 more enslaved men testified, each describing similar patterns of coercion and abuse. Then came Ada, Ruth Claiborne's enslaved nurse. She testified about confronting Ruth and about the threat Ruth had made against Ada's daughter. Her testimony established that at least some of the women had been consciously aware their actions were wrong and had been actively working to conceal them. The final witness was unexpected. Dr. Henry Garrett, a Blackwater physician who attended several of Magnolia Hill's elite families. He testified that he had been called to examine Calpurnia Delacroix in July after she complained of female troubles. His examination had revealed evidence consistent with frequent sexual activity, surprising in a woman whose husband had been traveling for business during the previous month. At the time he had noted this oddity, but had not spoken of it, assuming perhaps an affair with someone of her own class. Now, in light of the other testimony, the significance of his findings became clear. The inquiry concluded late that evening. The panel deliberated for less than an hour before reaching their verdict. The accusations were credible and supported by substantial evidence. Bishop Claiborne directed that a formal report be prepared and delivered to the governor of Louisiana, along with a recommendation that criminal charges be filed against all 8 women. The next morning, September 11th, Bishop Claiborne personally delivered the inquiry's findings to Governor Ezra Merrow at the state capitol. Merrow read the report in silence, his face growing increasingly flushed. When he finished, he looked up at the bishop, with something close to despair in his eyes. "Do you understand what you are handing me? If this becomes public, it will destroy some of Louisiana's most prominent families. It will suggest that our entire social order is built on hypocrisy and perversion. I understand completely, Governor. I also understand that justice demands action, regardless of the social consequences." Merrow stood and walked to his window, echoing Bishop Claiborne's earlier gesture at his own home. Outside, Blackwater conducted its ordinary business, unaware that its foundations were about to shift. "I will have to involve the state legislature. This is too large for executive action alone. We will need to convene an emergency session." "When?" "Give me 3 days to prepare the ground. Some of the legislators are friends or relations of the accused women. I need to speak with key members privately before this goes to the full assembly." "And the women? Should they be arrested?" Merrow shook his head slowly. "Not yet. If we arrest them now, before the legislature has determined how to proceed, we risk legal challenges that might compromise the entire case, but I will have them placed under discreet surveillance. If any attempt to flee Blackwater, we will detain them immediately." That same afternoon, Merrow summoned his most trusted aide, a lawyer named Robert Stannard, who had served 3 governors and possessed both discretion and moral clarity. Merrow handed him the inquiry report and watched as Stannard read through it, his expression shifting from curiosity to revulsion. "Dear God," Stannard whispered when he finished, "how long has this been occurring?" "Since March, as far as we can determine, possibly longer in some cases. I need you to conduct preliminary legal research. What charges can we bring under Louisiana law? What precedents exist? And most importantly, how do we proceed without creating a public spectacle that damages Louisiana's reputation throughout the nation?" Stannard spent the next 2 days in the state law library, poring over statutes and case records. What he discovered was both encouraging and problematic. Louisiana law clearly prohibited adultery and fornication with penalties that included public whipping and fines. Several 18th century cases had resulted in convictions of white women for sexual relations with enslaved men. Thought these typically involved poor women without social standing. But nowhere in Louisiana's legal history could Stannard find a case remotely similar to this one. Wealthy, socially prominent women systematically exploiting multiple enslaved men over an extended period. The closest parallel was a 1762 case from New Orleans involving a tavern keeper's wife. But that woman had been quickly convicted and whipped in the public square. Applying the same punishment to women from Louisiana's oldest families seemed both legally appropriate and politically impossible. Stannard reported his findings to Merrow on the evening of September 13th. "The law is clear on the criminality of their actions," he explained. "But enforcing that law in this case presents extraordinary challenges. These women have powerful family connections throughout Louisiana. Several legislators are their cousins or brothers-in-law. If we pursue standard legal proceedings, we'll face challenges at every stage. What do you recommend? An extraordinary measure. Convene the legislature in emergency session. Present them with the evidence and let them determine how to proceed. This removes the decision from your office and spreads the responsibility across the entire General Assembly. Whatever they decide will carry the weight of collective judgment rather than executive fiat." Merrow nodded slowly. "And if they choose to protect these women, if family loyalty outweighs justice, then we will have learned something terrible about Louisiana's moral character. But I don't believe that will happen. The evidence is too damning, and the men who sit in that chamber still believe, however imperfectly, in principles of honor and law." Over the next 2 days, Governor Merrow conducted a series of private meetings with legislative leaders. He met first with Speaker of the House James Barber, a man known for uncompromising integrity despite his own slaveholding interests. Barber read the inquiry report in Merrow's office, his face darkening with each page. "This is an abomination," Barber said when he finished. "These women have violated every principle of Christian civilization. They have degraded themselves, corrupted their households, and brought shame upon Louisiana. Will you support an emergency session? I will, and I will support whatever punishment the Assembly deems appropriate regardless of who these women's families are. Marrow met next with key senators, with committee chairmen, with the leaders of various legislative factions. The response was universally shocked, though some expressed more concern about scandal than about justice. Senator William Rives, whose wife was distantly related to Calpurnia Delacroix, argued vehemently for handling the matter, quietly, perhaps through civil proceedings that would avoid public exposure. If this becomes known, Rives insisted, it will provide ammunition for every abolitionist newspaper in the North. They will use this to argue that slavery corrupts everyone it touches, that Southern society is morally bankrupt. We must consider Louisiana's reputation. Marrow's response was sharp. Louisiana's reputation is not built on concealing evil, Senator. It is built on addressing evil when we discover it. Would you have us protect these women simply because their exposure might prove inconvenient? By the evening of September 13th, Marrow had secured enough support to convene the emergency session. He drafted the official summons, citing matters of urgent moral and legal concern requiring immediate legislative attention. The session would convene the following morning at 9, and attendance was mandatory for all members of both houses. Meanwhile, in Magnolia Hill, the 8 women had begun to sense that something was terribly wrong. Eliza Voss noticed strange men watching her house, men who made no effort to approach but who seemed to be documenting everyone who entered or left. When she sent Silas to inquire at the market about household supplies, he returned with news that similar men were positioned near the other women's homes. Eliza immediately called an emergency meeting of the Sisterhood, sending coded messages through her most trusted servants. The women gathered at Ruth Claiborne's house that evening, their usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "We're being watched," Eliza announced without preamble. "All of us. Someone knows." Calpurnia Delacroix went pale. "That's impossible. We've been so careful. No one outside our group knows about our arrangement. Someone knows. The question is who and what they plan to do with that knowledge." Eveline Marrow stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "We should leave Blackwater tonight before whatever is coming actually arrives." "And go where?" Ruth demanded. "If we flee, we confirm guilt. We must stay and present a united front. Whatever accusations are made, we deny them absolutely. It's our word against the word of slaves, and Louisiana law is clear about whose testimony matters." Eliza was not so sure. "Louisiana law is also clear about adultery. If someone has actual evidence, not just testimony, our social standing may not protect us." "What evidence could they possibly have?" Calpurnia asked. "We've left no written records, no documentation of any kind." Even as she said it, she felt a cold sensation in her stomach, a sudden doubt about the security of her coded journal. The women debated through the evening, but they reached no consensus. Some wanted to flee, others to stay and fight, still others to seek help from their powerful family connections. They parted near midnight with a plan to reconvene the following day, unaware that by then their fates would already be sealed. On September 14th, the emergency legislative session convened behind closed doors. Only members of the General Assembly were permitted to attend. No press or public observers. Governor Marrow took his position at the front of the chamber and waited for silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound regret. "Gentlemen, I have called you here today to address a matter of such grave moral import that I can scarcely find words adequate to its description. What I am about to present will shock you. It will offend your sensibilities and challenge your understanding of the society we have built here in Louisiana. But I ask you to listen with open minds and to remember that justice, however painful, must be our guiding principle." He then presented the inquiry report, reading selected portions aloud and distributing copies to key legislators. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the scandal became clear. When Marrow finished, he opened the floor for questions and debate. Senator Thomas Ritchie, a man of 72 years who had known some of the accused women since their childhoods, rose first. His voice shook with emotion. "Governor Marrow, these are daughters of Louisiana's most respected families. Women I have known personally for decades. Are we absolutely certain of these accusations?" "The evidence is overwhelming, Senator. written documentation, multiple witness testimonies, even medical evidence. The inquiry panel consisted of 5 men of unimpeachable character who reviewed everything carefully. Their conclusion was unanimous. Delegate John Minor rose next. What of the enslaved men who testified? How do we know they are telling the truth? Might they have motivations to slander their mistresses? Marrow had anticipated this question. What possible motivation would they have? Coming forward exposed them to enormous risk. They faced potential sale, separation from their families, or worse. They gained nothing from this testimony except the possibility that the abuse might end. The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly heated. Men stood and condemned the women in language of biblical fury. Others defended them, arguing that the real villains were the enslaved men who had somehow seduced their mistresses. Several legislators with direct family connections to the accused women recused themselves from the proceedings, their faces gray with shame and fury. Delegate Samuel McDowell delivered perhaps the most powerful speech of the session. He was a younger man, only 34, known for his legal acumen and moral seriousness. He rose near the middle of the debate and spoke without notes, his voice clear and firm. Gentlemen, I understand the impulse to protect these women. They are our neighbors, our family members, women we have been raised to view as paragons of virtue. But that is precisely why this matter is so serious. These women did not simply commit adultery. They systematically exploited human beings over whom they held absolute power. They used the institution of slavery itself as a mechanism for their own gratification, violating both the laws of God and the laws of Louisiana. Some here have suggested that the enslaved men somehow seduced these women. I would ask those colleagues to consider the nature of power in these relationships. How does a man who can be whipped or sold for disobedience seduce the woman who holds his fate in her hands? This was not seduction. This was coercion, pure and simple, and the women wielded that coercion. We are often told that slavery is a civilizing institution, that it brings Christianity and order to an inferior race. How can we maintain that argument while simultaneously arguing that enslaved men corrupted their pure white mistresses? Either these men are inferior and incapable of such corruption, or they are equal to us in their capacity for moral agency. We cannot have it both ways. I propose that we face this matter with the honesty it demands. These women committed grave crimes. They violated their marriage vows. They corrupted their households, and they brought disgrace upon Louisiana. The law provides remedies for such crimes, and we must apply those remedies regardless of the social status of the offenders. To do otherwise is to admit that we have one law for the powerful and another for everyone else. McDowell's speech shifted the tenor of the debate. Several legislators who had been wavering now spoke in favor of prosecution, but the question remained, what form should that prosecution take? The Assembly debated various options through the afternoon and into the evening. Criminal prosecution under adultery statutes would require public trials, which would inevitably become spectacles covered by newspapers throughout the nation. Some legislators argued this was necessary, that justice required full transparency. Others insisted it would damage Louisiana's reputation irreparably and provide propaganda for abolitionists. A third option emerged during the evening session proposed by Senator Benjamin Watkins Lee. What if we offer them exile, remove them from Louisiana permanently, confiscate their property to their husbands, but spare them public trial and punishment? This achieves justice while limiting the scandal. The proposal sparked immediate debate. Some saw it as too lenient, allowing wealthy women to escape consequences that poor women would face without question. Others saw it as appropriately balanced, punishing the women severely while protecting Louisiana from national humiliation. Delegate McDowell rose again. I understand the appeal of this compromise, but I must ask, are we creating precedent that the wealthy can buy their way out of criminal prosecution? What message does that send? Senator Lee responded thoughtfully, we are not allowing them to buy anything. We are forfeiting their property and banishing them from their homeland forever. For women of their class, that is a punishment perhaps more severe than a public whipping. They lose everything, their homes, their families, their social positions, their very identities as Louisianans, and Louisiana is spared the spectacle of putting its most prominent women on trial for sexual crimes. The debate continued past midnight, finally reaching a vote near 1 in the morning on September 15th. The measure passed by a narrow margin. The women would be charged under Louisiana's adultery statutes, but offered the option of permanent exile in lieu of criminal trial. If they accepted exile, they would forfeit all property to their husbands, agree never to return to Louisiana under penalty of imprisonment, and accept strict non-disclosure agreements forbidding them from speaking publicly about the case. A second vote addressed the enslaved men who had testified. After lengthy debate, the Assembly voted to purchase them from their owners at fair market value and grant them conditional freedom. They would be required to leave Louisiana within 30 days and would face re-enslavement if they ever returned. It was an imperfect solution, one that acknowledged the men as victims while simultaneously treating them as threats to social order that needed to be removed from Louisiana. The final vote concerned the records themselves. The inquiry report, the legislative debate transcripts, and all related documents would be sealed in the state archives for 75 years, not to be opened before 1924. This provision passed with overwhelming support. Seven legislators who had pushed for harsher punishment recognized the value of limiting public knowledge of the scandal. On September 15th, before dawn, officials arrived at the 8 homes to inform the women of the charges against them and the terms of their exile. State deputies, accompanied by lawyers and witnessed by notaries, delivered formal documents detailing their options: accept immediate exile and property forfeit, or face criminal prosecution in open court. Eliza Voss received her notice at 5:30 in the morning. She read it carefully, her face betraying no emotion, while Abram stood nearby with his own lawyer. When she finished, she looked up at her husband of 19 years. "You knew," she said. "It was not a question." "I suspected. I chose not to see clearly until I could no longer avoid it. Will you divorce me?" "I have already filed the papers. They will be finalized within the month." Eliza nodded slowly. "I suppose I should feel shame. I find I do not. I feel only anger that I lived in a cage so long without recognizing it for what it was." "You violated everything we claim to hold sacred," Abram replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You took men who had no choice, no power to refuse you, and you used them for your own gratification. Do not dress that up as some kind of rebellion against injustice. And yet you see no injustice in the system that gave me absolute power over them in the first place. You see no problem with a society that treats human beings as property, but then expresses shock when that property is used in ways you find distasteful." Abram had no answer for that. He turned and left the room, and Eliza began the process of packing her belongings. She had 24 hours to prepare for permanent exile from the only home she had ever known. Calpurnia Delacroix's response was far more dramatic. When the officials arrived at her home, she collapsed completely, sobbing uncontrollably and claiming that she had been led astray by Eliza's evil influence. Her husband remarkably stood by her side throughout her breakdown, his face set in an expression of grim determination. "She is my wife," he told the officials. "Whatever she has done, she is still my wife. If she must leave Louisiana, I will go with her. Our marriage vows did not include exceptions for scandal or disgrace." The officials seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected loyalty. They explained that he was under no legal obligation to accompany her, that he could divorce her and retain all property and social standing. But he shook his head firmly. "I made promises before God. I will keep them." Ruth Claiborne became furiously indignant, insisting that as a white woman of impeccable lineage, she could not possibly be guilty of such charges. "This is a conspiracy by Northern abolitionists," she declared to the bemused officials. "They have coerced our slaves into giving false testimony to damage Louisiana's reputation. I will not dignify these accusations by accepting their terms." "Then you will face trial, Mrs. Claiborne," the lead official replied calmly. "The evidence against you is substantial. I would strongly advise accepting exile." Ruth's defiance lasted approximately 2 hours until her family lawyer arrived and explained in stark terms what a public trial would entail. The testimony would be explicit and damning. Her family name would be dragged through every newspaper in America. Her children and grandchildren would bear the stain of her scandal. By noon, she had signed the documents accepting exile. Eveline Marrow simply went silent, retreating into a catatonic state from which her family could not rouse her. A physician was called who diagnosed a complete nervous collapse. She would eventually recover enough to travel, but would never speak coherently about the events of September 1849. Her husband divorced her quietly, and she was sent to live with distant relatives in Pennsylvania, who agreed to take her on condition that she never be left alone with male servants. Over the following week, the 8 women departed Blackwater at various times and by various routes. Eliza Voss left, first on the evening of September 16th. She traveled by hired carriage to New Orleans, where she boarded a steamship to Charleston. She carried 2 trunks of clothing, a small box of jewelry that was legally her own rather than her husband's, and $300 in cash. Everything else she had owned now belonged to Abram. As her carriage rolled through Blackwater's darkened streets, she looked back once at the town of her birth. Magnolia Hills manors were silhouetted against the night sky, their windows lit with lamplight, families gathering for evening meals in rooms where she would never be welcome again. She felt no tears, no regret, only a cold clarity about what her life had been and what it might become. Calpurnia Delacroix and her loyal husband departed 3 days later, traveling north to Philadelphia. Before leaving, Calpurnia asked to see Ezra one final time. The officials denied this request, explaining that she was forbidden from any contact with the men who had been involved. She wept at this denial, crying that she wanted to apologize to explain that she had never meant to hurt anyone. Her husband gently but firmly led her to their carriage. Ruth Claiborne left for Baltimore with her eldest daughter, who had volunteered to accompany her into exile, despite the damage it might do to her own marriage prospects. The other women departed in similar fashion, some alone, some with family members who chose loyalty over reputation. By September 23rd, all 8 had left Louisiana, and Magnolia Hill Society began the painful process of erasing them from its collective memory. Meanwhile, Silas, Ezra, and the other men who had testified received their papers of conditional freedom on September 20th. The document was brief, printed on official state stationery and signed by Governor Marrow himself. It stated simply that they had been manumitted by the Commonwealth of Louisiana as compensation for their testimony in a matter of state importance, and that they were required to depart Louisiana by October 20th. Silas read his papers 3 times, unable to quite believe what they represented. Freedom. It was a word he had heard all his life, but never expected to experience. But it was freedom with sharp limitations. He could never return to Louisiana, could never see his mother's grave once she died, could never walk the streets of the only town he had ever known. He gathered his wife and mother and explained what had happened, showing them the papers with hands that shook slightly. His mother, Eveline, wept silently. She was 61 years old and had been enslaved for her entire life. The idea of freedom at her age was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Where will we go?" his wife asked. "North Philadelphia, maybe somewhere with a large community of free black people where we might find work and build a life." "And what do we tell people? How do we explain how we got free?" Silas looked at his freedom papers again. "We tell them the truth that we testified in a legal matter and Louisiana chose to free us. We don't need to explain what we testified about." Before leaving Blackwater, Silas returned to St. Mary's Church one final time. He found Reverend Thorne in the small library where they had first met, where Silas had taken the enormous risk of accusing some of Blackwater's most powerful women. "I came to thank you, sir," Silas said, "for believing me, for acting when you could have chosen to look away." Thorne stood and gripped Silas's hand tightly. "I am sorry I could not do more. I am sorry. Louisiana's laws could not offer you real justice, only this half measure of freedom with exile attached. It's more than I had any right to expect. It's more than most enslaved people will ever see. You gave me something I never thought I would have. What will you do in Philadelphia?" "Find work, build a life. Try to forget what happened in that house on Cypress Street." Thorne nodded slowly. "I hope you can forget. But I also hope that someday when slavery is finally ended, people will remember what you endured. Not for vengeance, but for understanding, so that future generations might grasp how completely this system corrupted everyone it touched." Silas left Blackwater on October 3rd, traveling by hired wagon with his wife and mother. They reached Philadelphia 11 days later, arriving with almost no money and no connections in the city. But Silas was skilled as a carpenter, and he found work within a week. He rented a small house in the district where free black people were concentrated, and slowly, painfully, he began to build a new life. He never spoke publicly about what had happened to him in Blackwater, but he did write it down. In a journal he kept hidden in his workshop, he documented everything. Eliza Voss's first summons, the systematic abuse that followed, the growing horror as he realized other men were experiencing the same exploitation, the terrifying decision to approach Reverend Thorne, the inquiry, the legislative session he'd not been allowed to attend, and finally the freedom papers that had sent him into exile. Ezra went to New York, settling in the growing black community in Lower Manhattan. Unlike Silas, he did speak about his experience, though never using his real name or identifying the women specifically. He became involved in the abolitionist movement, attending meetings and occasionally giving testimony about the realities of slavery. His accounts of being exploited by his mistress provided powerful ammunition for abolitionist arguments that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, white and black alike. At an anti-slavery meeting in 1853, Ezra spoke to a crowd of nearly 200 people. "They tell you that slavery is a civilizing institution," he said, his voice carrying across the packed hall. "They tell you that it benefits both master and slave, that it brings Christianity and order to an inferior race. But I can tell you from my own experience that slavery is nothing but corruption. It corrupts the enslaved by stripping them of autonomy and dignity, and it corrupts the enslaver by giving them absolute power over other human beings. Absolute power without check or balance, without accountability or restraint, and that power will be abused. It cannot be otherwise." Thither men scattered across the North, some to Philadelphia, others to New York, Boston, or even Canada. A few tried to build normal lives, finding work and starting families and trying to forget Blackwater. Others could not escape the memories and lived haunted lives broken by what had been done to them. Back in Blackwater, the scandal's echoes continued to reverberate through Magnolia Hill society, despite the official silence. The 8 families whose women had been exiled found themselves socially isolated, invited to fewer gatherings, excluded from committees and boards where they had once been central figures. Some of the families left Blackwater entirely, moving to other cities where their names carried less baggage. The enslaved people who had witnessed the scandal but had not testified lived in a strange limbo. They knew what had happened, had seen things that violated every stated principle of the society they lived in, but they were forbidden from speaking about it. The knowledge sat inside them like poison, creating a shared understanding among Blackwater's black community that the white families they served were capable of profound hypocrisy. Ada, Ruth Claiborne's former nurse, chose to remain in Blackwater despite her newfound freedom. At 73, she was too old to start over in a new place, too tired to begin again. She lived with her daughter in Asmal House in Gators Hollow, surviving on the small amount of money Ruth had been allowed to give her before leaving Louisiana. In her final years, Ada would sometimes sit on her porch in the evenings and look up toward Magnolia Hill, toward the manors where she had spent her life serving people who claimed moral superiority while practicing profound evil. She never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed, but she made certain her daughter and granddaughters knew the truth. "Don't ever let them tell you they're better than us," she would say. "Don't ever believe that white skin or fine houses make people good. I've seen what they really are when nobody's watching." She died in 1860, just months before the Civil War would begin to tear apart the society she had known. She was buried in Blackwater's African cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that gave her name and dates, but no hint of the role she had played in exposing Magnolia Hill's darkest secret. The official records of the incident remained sealed in the Louisiana State Archives exactly as the legislature had mandated. The vault that contained them was opened periodically for routine maintenance, but the documents inside remained untouched. Even the archivists who maintained the collection did not know what the sealed files contained, only that they were not to be opened before 1924. Blackwater society absorbed the scandal as best it could, creating a sanitized narrative that preserved reputations while obscuring truth. The official story was that 8 women from prominent families had been involved in financial improprieties and had chosen exile to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. This version was repeated so often that many people came to believe it, preferring a tale of white-collar crime to the reality of what had actually occurred. But truth has a way of persisting even when officially suppressed. In the kitchens and laundry rooms, in the quarters where enslaved people lived, the real story circulated. It was told in whispers passed down through generations, modified and embellished until it took on an almost mythical quality. Some versions claimed there had been 20 women involved. others that the women had been practicing some form of witchcraft or devil worship. But at the core of every version was the essential truth. Blackwater's most respectable ladies had systematically exploited their male slaves in ways that violated every stated principle of Southern civilization. And so the shadows linger, fading into the candle's dying flicker. In the hush of forgotten litanies, where sins echo eternal, the bayou claims its own, forever veiled in twilight's mournful shroud.